What's up, you guys? It's been a while. I have missed you. I've also been very busy. I'm glad that we get to to chat today because I have a question for you. My question is, what do ancient Roman roads and a modern 3D printing have in common? According to our guest today, they are both links in the invisible machinery that drives global wealth and local prosperity. My dear friend Stephanie Forbes is an internationally recognized expert in supply chain strategy and operational resilience. As the founder and CEO of the Forbes Group, she has spent over 25 years transforming complex global systems into agile, value-driven ecosystems for giants in energy, manufacturing, and tech sectors. Today, I'm thrilled that she can join us to discuss her groundbreaking new book, Global Wealth, Local Impact, and where we're diving into how the timeless lessons of trade routes can help us navigate today's volatile economy. Welcome, Stephanie, to the show. It's so good to have you again.
Thank you so much, Kat. It is once again an absolute honor to be here, and it is great to connect with you again. So thank you for having me.
Our pleasure, my pleasure. So, global wealth, local impact, where do we begin? When you gave me this manuscript, and I was very honored to be asked of my endorsement, little old me endorsing this magnificent book. I picked it up and I read it, and the first page made me laugh out loud. And it had to do with it began with imagine that you are a procurement specialist for the gladiators in the Coliseum.
Yeah, and you got to find a shark for the games on Thursday or Tuesday.
Right. And by the way, he needs to be hungry.
But not too hungry that he's floating upside down. But yeah, you need to get some sharks, and need to get them from the Coliseum, from the Mediterranean into the Coliseum. So yeah, so great question. What do 3D printing and the Coliseum and getting sharks have to do with anything? Well, they're all driving different activities within their respective supply chains. And as we watch the world remap how it gets things, everything from food and energy to medicine and appliances and manufactured goods and everything in between, as we remap how we're doing that, one of the things that we're really able to see is that historically, over thousands of years, we've time and time again remapped our supply chains based on different geopolitical events of the era. And one of the things that I tried to do is I tried to highlight in the book specific activities that occurred at different times that actually shaped the foundations for what we have today. And in Rome, they were magical logistics gurus, right? So they, ports and road systems and aqueducts, so really big infrastructure. And we see that a lot today, right? So we see that in warehousing and distribution centers and, the port authorities and container shipping. That's part of what we live with today. And that started 2,000 years ago. The other one that we look at is like the Silk Road. The Silk Road was like currency exchanges. So they would take Roman currency, different Asian currencies, different Persian currencies, and they would figure out what the exchange rate was based on the different currency types, depending on what you were buying. They also had quality control. There was no watching out for fake silk, if you can believe, that was a thing, right? And so like it was just really, really amazing. And probably one of my favorite, well, it is one of my favorites, but it's tied there with the Romans, is the East India Company. So this was an absolute monster of an organization that controlled like 2/3 of global trade at one time. And it was just absolutely massive. They had their own army that rivaled the British Army. They did everything, but it was the first corporation which shared risk. It was the development of this tiny little thing called insurance through the Lloyd's of London Coffee House. And so you have all of these things that we now take for granted in some of our modern contracts, like, a giant corporation with shared risk through shareholders and insurance provisions. So it's just been really fun. And all of those things exist in our current economic and geopolitical exchange. So we have currency exchanges, we have diversification of risk, we have insurance provisions, we have infrastructure projects. They all are part of our modern dilemma and economic drivers.
Indeed, indeed. Even the Silk Road a number of years ago was actually repurposed for, as in almost like a crypto sort of ecosystem, albeit of questionable
Ethics?
merchants and yes. But that's I mean conceptually same thing, right? Like the currency exchanges, the buyer beware, the looking out for, fake goods or like having street cred
Yep.
when working with others, astounding, astounding. I remember even when, with respect to the East India Trading Company, I often watch C dramas. You know what C dramas are? Like Chinese dramas.
Yeah.
And they're often set in sort of the Qing dynasty, which I'm actually astounded at how much Chinese history you know. Like that's pretty impressive. But some of these C dramas actually have influences of, actually not even influences, representation from the East India Trading Company. Like there would be people that are actually trading with the Chinese, and some of it is a little bit questionable in nature in terms of ethics, in that there's opium involved, and the use of their military in almost forcing,
Was
and
forcing.
sometimes as you say in the book, allowing for local, what was it? Local Sikhs, not Sikhs, local
The Maharaj,
leaders.
the leaders
Yes,
in
that's right.
India, yeah, and
Right.
the subcontinent was Bengal at the time. So basically, what they did there is they bought off a local ruler to control a portion of the subcontinent, and so that ruler then received a large amount of money every year to offload, a lot of responsibility, honestly, right? So they, then the East India Company said, okay, you're gonna go, produce all these things, you're going to sell it to us at this price. These are all kind of the rules for trade. The problem with that is, as I noted in the book, is through their practices, the East India companies through their practices exacerbated a famine that caused 2/3 of that population to perish, which
Here.
is what ended up happening there. Is then you ended up with a bunch of regulations that came through Britain at the time to regulate and actually took ownership of all the East India Company assets because of what was transpiring there. And that's how you ended up with Britain in India as sort of a sovereign
Mediator, if you will.
mediator, kind of
Almost.
owning it
Yeah.
for a while until I think it was, I can't actually remember when that actually dissolved, but that's actually how that transpired, was through an act of the Parliament within Great Britain to take control over that because it was being abused so seriously and causing a lot of death, and there's a lot of
Right.
corruption and there's a few other things there. And that draws really similar parallels to what we're kind of seeing in the world right now, where we have some people, to your example, that are on the Silk Road side of that digital Silk Road doing things ethically and appropriately, and then the others that aren't. And so how do you, sort of build up that credibility?
Hmm.
And there's a lot of lessons that sort of keep repeating themselves a little bit. And in the supply chain space, one of the things that is really fantastic for an organization is this vertical integration,
Mm.
right? So the East India Company did that fantastically. Vertically integrated, they all the way down to the people who were picking the spices, they had control over the whole supply chain. But it allowed abuses to occur and it allowed for operating in a monopoly. So you have these
Right.
organizations now operating in a monopoly situation. And that's bad for people. That's bad for workers. That's bad for, appropriate business transactions. When somebody has more leverage than another, things become lopsided. And that's
Mm.
where you end up with, actually a lot of what our modern slavery laws are all about protecting, is about, getting appropriate wages. They're about making sure that, people have provisions in there to be able to quit or do something else. They're not beholden to like do this one thing for the rest of their life because they're stuck there. So those are some things that we're seeing in modern day sort of play out, is these vertical integrations, which exist in a lot of areas, but they're still causing some poor behaviors around how we treat people that are in those industries. We've seen it in the textile industry. We've all heard of examples of people being stuck in factories and those
Right.
factories either collapse or burn or something. Like we've heard all of those stories. And
Yep.
so it's really important to make sure that as we navigate future forward, we're we're not only protecting our people, but we're trying to learn from some of these past events and activities.
Yeah, the thing that astounds me is that are all of the parallels that you're able to draw from, like, we're talking not even in recent history. We're talking like 2000 years ago, like hundreds and hundreds of years ago in terms of the Silk Road, right? Like it was still, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was in the three-digit years, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, so the Silk Road lasted for quite some time. I want to say it was like I want to say it was almost 1,000 years because it was operating while the Romans were still at the height. So you still had all the Caesars and stuff like that, which is roughly 2,000 years ago. And the Silk Road operated all the way up in, and I'm trying to remember the name of that exact dynasty. And so I'm going to call it like 12, 1300.
Tang? The Tang dynasty, maybe?
Tang, yes, thank you. It's
Mm,
up until about the Tang dynasty. And so that was about, call it 13, 12, 1300 years-ish, sort of. And then what happened is you just had a dissolution of how all those groups worked together. And so you had a lot of infighting. And so the Silk Road no longer became a safe and viable route. By then you had, the East India Company and other different types, the Dutch trading company coming on the scene. And so they, with the ports and the boats, they could move goods around by water safer and faster than the inland Silk Road. And so you had this new technology of ships and ports and docks displacing the traditional caravans and Silk Roads and camels in and around sort of that time frame of about 1300 AD. So you have a change of method and mode as well as technological advancement. It doesn't seem like advanced to us at this point in
no.
time, but it was quite advanced. Like the ships that you started getting, in terms of at the East India time, you'd have multiple ships. You'd have 4 and 5 ships sailing at the same time. You'd divide up your loads. They could move really heavy loads of like pottery and of course fabrics and silks and spices and like big barrels of spices. And if you put those on camels, you have a really long, like several hundred camels. And the risk of being attacked and of losing some or all of your goods, plus just the treacherous nature of those journeys on the Silk Road meant moving that volume of goods was really
It's
difficult and was
hard.
really
Yeah.
risky. And
Yeah.
so you started offloading some of that risks through new technology, which was the ports and the boats and the
Right.
advent of new trading systems. So it was kind of interesting. I really loved honestly the Silk Road's ability to network and understand their communities. They were also one of the first that came up with letters of credit. So
Right.
if you were going from, say, like Chennai to Constantinople, you wouldn't travel with your billfold with all your money, right? There would be a letter that you would be sent, and someone in Chennai would say, please extend credit to Mr. Bob, and then they'd get to Constantinople, and that person would receive credit, and they trusted each other. So you had this huge trust relationship over huge distances that extended letters of credit so you didn't have to move money. And so like really, really neat stuff that they
And so that's
started
the
doing.
banking
That was
industry,
like
isn't it?
yeah, so that's like that is your modern banking. That's your diversification. It's, making sure that your friends don't get robbed, but it was all based on trust and relationships and reputation. And so
Right.
if you had a bad reputation, it didn't matter that you were traveling all this distance. Somebody would find out. Like, and so like
Yes.
reputation meant everything. And it was just a really what I really think was a really great way of doing business, which was, trust and relationship based.
Yeah.
And it was all about working together and community, and they really had a great method for how they did business and how they conducted themselves. It was very transparent and community oriented.
And so what astounds me is that like it's still that way today when you say trust and relationships and reputation, you see that in business today. I'm not going
Mhm.
to do business with you if I don't like and trust and respect you, right?
Yeah.
Or if I do, that business relationship is not going to last for very long.
And actually, you're 100%. I wrote a whole chapter in the book on partnerships and alliances. And it really talks about how do we work with each other? How do we ensure success? And that comes from making sure that we trust each other, that makes we have a relationship, that we build on it, that we don't do things that erode, trust or impact each other negatively. Because when we look at, for example, your business of, ERP implementations, it's really hard to implement something and work with people if they don't trust you.
Right.
It's almost, I'm
It
going to say,
doesn't
actually say it's
work.
impossible, right? Like you can't do it. So like, in your world, that trust and relationship is foundational to having a successful outcome. And I think there are some places where we view those as very transactional, like here's my money, give me my thing. It's kind of goods based, but even goods based, we're seeing that change a lot. Like how many
Mhm.
things do we buy now, either at the grocery store or, maybe it's, even a technology item and it's, green certified, it's,
Mhm.
recyclable, and it's got all these certifications on it because we don't trust anything anymore and we
Yeah.
don't know what's in it. And so I think that there's a bit of a swinging back to, we need trust and we need relationships in the things that we buy, not just services, but goods too.
100%. And at even at a micro level, you are seeing things like reviews, right? Like even if you sell something on Facebook Marketplace as an individual, you have reviews. And so I specifically would not buy anything from anybody without a 4 or 5 star review. You got
Yeah.
a free 3 star or a 3 star rating? No, that's sketch, right? Because that
Yeah.
means I can, because the difference between a 5 star rating and a 3 star rating might be I can just leave you my good, the thing that I'm going to sell you, and I'm going to trust that you're going to leave money for me on my doorstep. I don't even have to be at home. So it allows for a lot more flexibility and because there's that trust there. And so like even if it's across like from strangers, that system is in place, the review system is in place so that it could be relied upon, right?
Yeah.
And so the Silk Road had that. And the Silk Road didn't necessarily have like this fancy, digital review system. It was intellectually stored, right, in people's minds, and people talk and the communication of it, right?
Yeah, it was very much colloquial knowledge, right? So you have
Mm.
these communities with, really in-depth colloquial knowledge, and you really understood what everyone was all about very quickly. They were excellent at kind of determining people's nature because it was a matter, in some cases, matter of life and death. But in other cases, the Silk Road was, as I'm sure you're well aware, very notorious for bandits and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were very careful about who was allowed on their road, right? And so they took it very, very seriously. Not that dissimilar from today in terms of what we see in terms of people taking safety and protection very seriously, but very similar in terms of that Facebook Marketplace review or, on your Uber app or on any
Mm-hmm.
app, right? You get the whatever rating and everyone reads the comments and, they see if somebody's responded or not. And that was very, very prevalent back then, is that sort of peer reviewed and enforced reputation.
Right.
Uh, was really, really quite fascinating. I love the idea that you'd walk into, these kind of Asaris, this little like tent village, right? And you'd have, this guy over here who would decide if it was legitimate silk. You'd have another guy over here who would decide what the currency conversion was. You'd have another guy over here that would decide if, if there was a dispute, they would resolve it for you. And then you had some enforcers around, depending on which geographical area we're in, to make sure there was no thieving or banditry happening. And then someone over there would, trade you camels for horses or horses for camels, depending which part of the journey you're going on. And so it was just a really interesting network. And it really was a network. It was a real analog network and system. And it really, I think, was foundational in terms of like how we do good business. And we see that on like Facebook Marketplace, right? That's a really good example of a sort of a digital version, right? You get your, how much am I paying? I barter
Yep.
with you. I check out your reviews, but if Susan from my HOA doesn't like you, then like you're out. Right. So like we still have
Yeah.
a lot of that came from the Silk Road, which I think is really a wonderful feel good story, to be quite honest.
Yeah, for real. What I love about your book is that it's not a history book. I mean, it draws from history, like, right? It draws interesting lessons from history and interesting anecdotes, or not anecdotes, stories from history.
Mhm.
And you apply it so well to what is going on in today's world, like current events and current issues that people in, not only in supply chain, but people in leadership, organizational leadership, need to navigate around, right? And so it really becomes this super practical guide for figuring out your supply chain. And quite honestly, Steph, like before I read your book, I didn't know that supply chain management was this whole entire world. Like, call me naive, but for me, supply chain management was limited to somebody issuing a purchase order, somebody doing a receipt in the system, and then somebody paying for a good or service through a payable. And I didn't at all think about the intricacies and having to navigate around geopolitical issues, or like what's going on in the Middle East right now, like in Iran and all of the Middle Eastern countries right now, is that it's cutting off supply for critical fuels for places like Thailand.
Well, it's impacting us everywhere. So, in really rough numbers, roughly 80% of our global energy is still oil and gas, right? We've got some
Mm,
renewables, we got some alternates, cool. 20% of that 80% energy comes from the Middle East here, comes through that Strait of Hormuz. And so what's happening is the available amount of energy has not shrunk, but is becoming volatile. We didn't suddenly reduce our energy consumption overnight by 20%. We still need that energy to cook our food, to fuel our vehicles, to fly our planes, to keep our houses warm, to like turn our lights on, right? Like, so we still require all that energy globally. And so what it's doing is it's really putting a strain on our ability to stay as a civilized society with, electricity and heat and air conditioning, depending on which part of the world you're in, and like all these things. Compound it with the fact, and we saw this the last time the Strait of Hormuz was impacted, when we can't move the container ships in the schedule that they're supposed to be moved in. That means the goods stay at port longer, the goods stay on the boat longer. And when you're talking about all the food that goes to and from other countries, it
perishable.
really, and they're
Yep.
perishable. And when you think about the Middle East and what do they personally grow, in a lot of cases, it's not a lot. They import a lot of goods and we export a lot of goods. We as Canadians export a lot of agricultural products. And so if we can't get our products to them, if they can't import their products from other nations, right? All of a sudden, it starts to impact your food costs. It starts to impact your ability to you're in the export business. You can't get your goods off the port because the boat hasn't arrived, and now you're paying for your sea can to sit there for an extra 2 weeks because they had to go around the Horn of Africa. So you just see this compounding issue where even if you wanted it to be there, it's not available to be there at any price. And then the
Right.
price that it is available at is now 20, 30, 50% more. And so you start ending up in this really sort of difficult place. And the concern there, if this stays like this for a really protracted period of time, we're going to end up in a bit of a recession globally. It's going to cause a huge amount of inflation. It's going to cause certain things to be no longer affordable, which means people can't buy them. And so it's going to really push the whole global economic base down. But what will happen is over a period of time, it'll take a couple years, but what's going to happen is those supply chains will get remapped. So what we will see is pipelines will be put in the ground. You'll see new ports being developed. You'll see alternate routes being designed. You'll see different ships being built. And so all of a sudden you'll see infrastructure and facilities change, be built, be adapted, be modified, be retrofitted, and then it'll tick back up again. We are absolute masters at solving this problem. We've solved this problem for 2,000 years old, 2,000 years. But there's always this gap of, okay, it's changing. What do we need to do to make it different? And where we're at, especially in Canada, is we need to build a bunch of infrastructure projects,
Mhm.
and that's going to take time. And we're not the only ones that are going to do that. The rest of the world's going to have to do that. But the immediate impacts of that energy constraint and the inability for those container ships to move freely is going to impact all of us globally. And that's why
Mhm.
you're seeing the reaction, like by the French as an example, where the French Navy is coming in and escorting. They're providing escort services for the boats along the Strait of Hormuz. And that was the latest I heard as about a week ago. So you're seeing a lot of nations that are concerned about the rapid increase in fuel prices and, other related prices, wanting to help ensure that there's smooth passage and, continuation of the flow of those goods and services.
I mean, I want to say it's a crazy world now, but I feel like it's always probably always been a crazy world. Just the definition of crazy has probably changed over time.
Well, the issue that we have is the level of disruption.
Mm,
So, and I actually, this was it was a slide from a presentation I did a while ago, but it talked about the level of disruption over years. And if we start back before COVID, right, the level of disruption, wasn't too bad.
mm.
But then effectively year over year, as we moved along, our level of disruption doubled. Like every year it
Doubled, no
doubled.
less.
Doubled, yeah. In some cases, slightly more than double, some cases slightly less, but like effectively for just easy math, doubled. And then we had what we would call black swan events, completely unforeseeable, totally random, like,
Pandemic.
we need
Mm.
somebody from Hollywood to try and imagine this kind of stuff. Like it's just not there. Well, now we have those things all the time. So there's no such thing really as a black swan event. They're like, well, aliens might arrive tomorrow and change this. All the boats might sink. And so you have all these sort of things that we never thought were possible anymore now being thrown into the risk register as this might actually happen. And so that's the big thing that we're having in terms of like how we collectively feel about it is because it's the constant level of disruption. We don't
Mm.
have a period where it's smooth and easy and normal. There's no normal anymore. How many times have we heard that?
Yeah,
There's no normal.
exactly. There's no
Disruption
new
is the
normal.
new
Yeah.
normal.
Mm.
And so that constant change, does create some, level of anxiety, but it also requires us to build redundancies, to come up with more contingency plans, to determine how we can improve our resilience and things like that. So that's where you're going to have like multiple sourcing options, right? So if I'm buying a raw material from somewhere, I'm going to make sure I have 3 suppliers that I can get it from, unless it's like
Right.
some magic, right? If I am on the other side of the world, I'm going to make sure that I don't rely on just one boat. I have 3 boats. Or if I'm, doing inland trucking, I've got, 4 or 5 trucking service companies I can call up, right? So everything is all about developing like contingency plans A through F,
Mm.
depending on where you are in the world and what your transportation options are. So those are the things that we're starting to see. And then we're also starting to see nations themselves from a geopolitical sphere go, how can we realign? How can we change our infrastructure? How can we approach some things differently? And so you're seeing at the nations level, like with political leaders of countries, they're starting to change how they want to interact with each other's supply chains. And the biggest one we're seeing right now is around critical minerals and
Mm.
anything related to mining. So
Mm.
steel, lithium, potash, uranium, like all those things are becoming sort of the number one, who has control and how are we sharing?
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much. So I know your book is on pre-order right now,
Yes.
and I actually have a quantity for you today of how much I would like to pre-order.
Okay.
And if somebody wants to pre-order your book, now officially it launches May
May
sometime,
12th.
right?
May
May
12th.
12th.
Yep.
And so it is available for pre-order right now at
So globalwealthlocalimpact.com is the page. You can go and you can select any retailer you like. So you could go to indigo.com, you could go to amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, any major retailer is going to have it. If you go to the globalwealthlocalimpact.com, you can get some bonuses. So if you register there and pre-order your book, there's some from freebies if you're interested.
nice. Everybody's interested in freebies.
I
Hello.
know, right? Get the purchase.
I love how you are so in tune about like creating this supply and how accessible it would be because there's 4 different, like lots of many different places, outlets where you can purchase this book. Well done. Well done.
It's all about redundancy these days, right?
Indeed. Indeed. Thank you so much for your discussion in regards to supply chain. And as always, it is such a pleasure to discuss these fun topics. Like when you say supply chain, it doesn't seem exciting, right? Like just the phrase supply chain,
Boring,
but
right?
like it's life. It is
It's every,
literally life,
it's every good and service on the planet.
right?
It's everything. And I think it's fascinating. I really do. I think it's absolutely fascinating because it's every single thing on the planet. It's all our food, it's all our jobs, it's art, it's culture, it's people, it's everything, it's our currency. And so when you take it all together as this big, huge what it is, it's utterly fascinating. And then, you pull on the strings, right? And, this one string might be logistics, this one thing might be quality, this one thing might be geopolitical, this one might be infrastructure and ports. It's all intertwined, and
All interconnected.
you can't tug one without impacting the others. And I think as we're seeing these disruptions, right, we're really seeing how interconnected and how you can't pull it apart. It's all one big thing.
Indeed, indeed. Globalwealthlocalimpact.com. Pre-order your copy today, and I can't wait to do so myself. Thank you again, Stephanie. We'll chat again.
Thanks, Kat. Appreciate you having me. Take care.